And it's just strange. Annie Guthrie, we don't think is staying there anymore, or her husband. We don't know where.
She smiles at you every morning from your television screen. Savannah Guthrie, America's sweetheart. But while she was sitting behind that anchor desk, something absolutely unthinkable was happening behind closed doors. Her own sister arrested for kidnapping their 84-year-old mother, an elderly woman who went to a family dinner and simply never came home. And the details investigators have uncovered since, they will genuinely make your stomach drop. Because this was not a stranger. This was not random. If law enforcement is right, the person responsible sat at that dinner table. Stay with us, because this story gets darker by the minute. To understand why this arrest landed the way it did, you have to go back to how this story first presented itself to the public. When Nancy Guthrie was reported missing, the family responded the way many families do in those early, desperate hours. They came forward. They spoke to cameras. Savannah Guthrie, a well-known face on American Morning. Television appeared composed and clearly distressed, asking for the public's help and for prayers. Annie was there too, calm by most accounts, standing alongside other family members as they made their appeal. At that point, the narrative was straightforward. An elderly woman had gone missing, her family was frightened, and authorities were working to find her. That image, a grieving family united in crisis, is what made the subsequent arrest so jarring. Within days, the same woman who had stood in front of cameras, pleading for her mother's safe return, became the focus of a law enforcement investigation. Annie Guthrie was taken in for questioning, and Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed that her arrest followed what he described as newly developed inconsistencies in the case. He did not elaborate in great detail during his initial statement, but the word inconsistencies carried enormous weight, given the context. That is not the kind of language investigators use casually, and the public picked up on that immediately. News of the arrest spread quickly. Social media was flooded within hours. Group chats, comment sections, news feeds, all of it moved fast, the way these stories tend to do when a recognizable name is attached. People who had been loosely following the story of a missing elderly woman suddenly found themselves deep in a case that felt much more complicated than it had originally appeared. So what do we actually know, and what does the timeline look like when you lay it out clearly? Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, was last seen on an evening that had, by all initial accounts, been completely ordinary. She had gone to Annie's home for dinner. By the descriptions given in early reports, it was a routine family gathering, the kind that happens in households all over the country. They shared a meal, spent time together, and later that evening, Annie's husband, Tommaso Caone, drove Nancy home. According to the timeline that investigators initially worked from, Tommaso dropped Nancy off at her residence, and digital records from the property showed the garage door opening at 9:48 in the evening and closing again at 9:50. That 2-minute window was treated early on as a relatively clean piece of data. Garage logs and home security systems are considered reliable because they are automated, they do not depend on human memory, and they create a consistent record. But reliability in one area does not mean the full picture is clear, because what happened after that drop-off is where things begin to unravel. In the early hours of the following morning, at 1:47 a.m., the camera on Nancy's front door was disconnected. Investigators specified that this was not a technical glitch, not a power outage, not a routine error. The camera had been physically interfered with. 41 minutes later, at 2:28 a.m., Nancy's pacemaker monitoring application, which had been connected to her phone and providing continuous data, also disconnected. Those 41 minutes, the gap between the camera going offline and the pacemaker app losing connection, became the central detail that investigators kept returning to. Law enforcement sources, speaking without attribution, indicated that this window was not treated as a coincidence. When you combine a physically tampered security camera with a pacemaker monitoring system going offline 41 minutes later, and an elderly woman who is then reported missing, the sequence starts to look less like a series of unfortunate technical failures and more like something deliberate. Sheriff Nanos and his team did not immediately lay out every detail to the public, which is standard practice in active investigations. But the information that did emerge through press conferences, anonymous sources speaking to journalists, and verified reporting from outlets including TMZ and local Arizona news organizations painted a picture that shifted the tone of the investigation considerably. A second search of Annie Guthrie's property was authorized, and what was documented during that search made an impression on everyone watching. Neighbors described seeing flashes of light moving through rooms as forensic teams photographed the interior. Deputies arrived with evidence bags and camera equipment. The garage received particular attention. Ceiling beams, floors, storage areas, all of it was photographed methodically. One neighbor who spoke to local reporters described the scene as resembling a full crime scene reconstruction rather than a routine follow-up visit. What made the timing of that second search particularly notable was that Annie reportedly was not present at the property when it took place. A representative for the family stated that she had temporarily relocated. That explanation prompted an immediate and polarizing reaction online. Supporters argued that the media attention surrounding the case had become overwhelming, that grief affects people differently, and that leaving a home surrounded by cameras and speculation is an entirely understandable response. Critics questioned the decision more bluntly, asking why someone central to an active investigation into their own mother's disappearance would choose that moment to leave. Neither position is unreasonable on its face, but investigators were not weighing in on the public debate. They were gathering information, and the picture they were assembling was growing more detailed by the day. What is important to note here is that at this stage in the investigation, no full official account of the evidence had been released. Sheriff Nanos confirmed the arrest and described it as the result of cumulative findings. He was deliberate in his language, careful not to overstate what had been established, and equally careful not to dismiss the seriousness of what his team had uncovered. FBI Director Kash Patel also addressed reporters during this period, describing the situation as active and evolving. He declined to confirm whether the arrest was directly tied to the 41-minute window, but did not deny it either. His most quoted statement was brief and pointed. He said that digital evidence rarely stands alone, a comment that many observers read as a signal that investigators were working across multiple streams of information simultaneously, not relying on any single piece of data to build their case. The arrest of Annie Guthrie did not answer the central question of what happened to Nancy Guthrie. Her whereabouts at the time this story broke remained unknown, and that fact sat heavily over everything else. A family that had appeared publicly united in searching for a missing mother was now fractured in a very different and very public way. Law enforcement was continuing its work. The investigation, by all accounts, was far from finished. What had begun as a missing persons case involving a well-known American family had, within the space of a few days, become something considerably more serious. The questions being asked were no longer just about where Nancy Guthrie was. They were about what happened inside that house, what those 41 minutes contained, and whether the people closest to her had any answers they had not yet given. Once the arrest had been confirmed and the initial wave of public reaction had settled into something slightly more measured, attention shifted to what investigators had actually been building behind the scenes. Because an arrest of this nature, one involving a family member in a high-profile missing persons case, does not happen on impulse. Law enforcement agencies, particularly when a case carries this level of public visibility, move carefully. They document, they verify, they cross-reference. And by the time Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed that Annie Guthrie had been taken into custody, his team had clearly been working across several distinct lines of inquiry simultaneously. The starting point, as it so often is in cases like this, was the timeline, not the broad strokes of it, but the granular detail. The kind of detail that only becomes visible when investigators begin pulling together data from multiple independent sources and placing them side by side. The evening in question had been described consistently in early reports as unremarkable. Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, had dinner at Annie's home. Family members present, food on the table, board games played. Nothing about the description of that evening suggested anything other than a quiet night in. Tommaso Chione, Annie's husband, then drove Nancy back to her own residence later that evening. The garage door at Nancy's property opened at 9:48 in the evening and closed at 9:50. That 2-minute window was logged automatically by the home's digital system, and it was initially treated as a clean, reliable data point, confirming the drop-off had taken place as described. But investigators did not stop there. Independently sourced traffic camera footage was reviewed and compared against the drop-off time that Tommaso had provided. According to reports from anonymous law enforcement sources speaking to journalists covering the case, the timestamps did not align perfectly. The discrepancy was not described as dramatic. It was characterized as small, a matter of minutes rather than hours. But in the context of a case where every minute carried potential significance, even a modest inconsistency was enough to justify a closer look. And once investigators began looking more closely at the drop-off timeline, they found that the questions did not stop there. The physical evidence gathered during the second search of Annie's property added another layer to what was already a complicated picture. Forensic teams returned to the property with camera equipment and evidence bags. They worked through the garage with particular thoroughness, photographing floors, storage containers, and ceiling beams. Neighbors who spoke to local reporters described watching the lights move from room to room through the windows. The kind of methodical sweep that signals investigators are looking for something specific rather than conducting a general review. Reports from sources described as close to the investigative team indicated that something was discovered during that second search, something significant enough to alter the direction of the investigation. Officials declined to name it publicly, which is consistent with how active investigations are typically managed. Confirming specific findings before a case reaches the courtroom can compromise the integrity of the process. But the language used by those with knowledge of the search was notable. One anonymous insider, as reported by outlets covering the case, said the discovery changed the direction of the investigation completely. That is a significant claim, and while it came from an unconfirmed source, it aligned with the observable shift in how law enforcement began moving in the days that followed. Among the items reportedly examined during this search was a vehicle linked to the family. Forensic technicians were said to have analyzed it for trace evidence, including fiber samples, soil, and digital GPS logs. One account, circulated widely online though not officially confirmed by investigators, claimed that soil found in the vehicle was inconsistent with the composition of either Nancy's property or Annie's home. Desert soil, different in its mineral makeup from what would be expected given the locations involved. Investigators have neither confirmed nor denied this specific claim, but the fact that it was not formally contradicted kept it circulating in public discussion. If accurate, it would suggest movement, a route, a location beyond the two properties at the center of the case. It would point toward planning. Alongside the physical evidence, digital forensics played a central role in how the investigation developed. This is increasingly standard in serious cases, particularly those involving elderly victims with connected home technology and families whose movements can be partially reconstructed through the devices they carry and the systems they interact with daily. The tampered front door camera, disconnected at 1:47 in the morning, had already drawn attention. The pacemaker monitoring application going offline 41 minutes later added to it. But investigators were also reportedly examining phone location data, encrypted messaging applications, and vehicle telemetry logs, the kind of information that modern devices generate passively and continuously, often without the people generating it giving it much thought. FBI Director Kash Patel, in his comments to reporters during this period, made a point of noting that digital evidence rarely stands alone. Reading context, that statement suggested investigators were working to build a case not around any single piece of data, but around the convergence of multiple streams, each one reinforcing or complicating the others. Phone pings corroborated or contradicted stated locations. GPS logs either matched or did not match the timeline as described. Deleted messages, if recovered, could provide context that no interview or statement had offered. It was around this time that reports of a potential financial motive began to emerge. A source described as close to the investigative team told TMZ that detectives had uncovered what they characterized as a financial motive that could not be ignored. Those words, financial motive, immediately broadened the public's understanding of what this case might actually be about. Nancy Guthrie was not simply an elderly woman who had gone missing. According to information that entered circulation through reporting on the case, she held significant assets. Property, investment accounts, and a family trust were all referenced. What drew particular attention was the claim, attributed to anonymous insiders speaking to journalists, that the trust had been updated in the weeks immediately preceding her disappearance. The specific nature of those changes was not publicly confirmed, but the timing was enough to raise serious questions among investigators and commentators alike. Who stood to benefit was the question that followed naturally, and it was the question that commentators, legal analysts, and members of the public were asking loudly and persistently. Investigators were reportedly examining financial records and looking at transfers between accounts linked to Annie and a business entity connected to Tommaso Chione. Again, these details came primarily from anonymous sources rather than official statements, which means they carry the uncertainty that always accompanies unconfirmed reporting. But the pattern of the investigation, the financial records, the vehicle analysis, the digital data, the second property search, suggested that law enforcement was building a picture that extended well beyond the question of who was present on the night Nancy disappeared. Tommaso Keone had not been charged at this point, but he had not faded from the story either. His past business dealings were being examined, spending patterns, social media posts, showing a lifestyle characterized by luxury purchases and international travel, renovation work on the family home. All of it was noted in press coverage and discussed at length online. None of that material was evidence of wrongdoing in itself. People spend money on things they enjoy, and visible prosperity is not an indicator of criminal behavior. But the context of an active kidnapping investigation changes how those details are perceived, and investigators were clearly aware of the financial dimension of the case. A former acquaintance of the family, speaking anonymously to reporters, claimed that there had been private disagreements within the family over caregiving responsibilities and financial control in the period leading up to Nancy's disappearance. This account was not verified independently, and unverified claims from unnamed sources need to be treated with appropriate caution. But in the absence of a clear official account of what motivated the events of that night, these pieces of information, however uncertain, filled the space that official silence left open. What emerged from all of this was a case that had grown considerably more complex than its early days suggested. The question was no longer simply where Nancy Guthrie was, though that remained the most urgent concern at the heart of everything. The investigation had expanded to encompass finances, digital records, physical forensics, and a timeline that investigators clearly believed had not yet been fully and honestly accounted for. The 41 minutes between the camera going offline and the pacemaker app disconnecting remained the detail everyone kept returning to. A fixed point in a story where so much else was still shifting. 41 minutes that no official account had yet explained, and that investigators, by all indications, had not stopped thinking about. By the time the arrest had been formally confirmed and the second search of the property had been completed, the case had moved beyond the realm of a missing persons investigation and into something that carried far greater legal and social weight. The fallout from Annie Guthrie's arrest did not unfold slowly. It arrived all at once, hitting multiple areas of public and private life simultaneously, the way these things tend to do when a story has already been running at full intensity for days and then suddenly shifts onto a new and more serious track. From a legal standpoint, the immediate question was what charges could realistically be sustained. Analysts and attorneys speaking to media outlets in the aftermath of the arrest discussed the range of possibilities. Kidnapping, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice were all mentioned as potential avenues, depending on what the evidence ultimately showed and how prosecutors chose to frame the case. No formal charges had been announced publicly at the time, and the prosecution had not revealed the full scope of what it was working with. But reports from sources familiar with the process indicated that a grand jury may already have been reviewing sealed evidence, a detail that suggested the legal machinery had been moving quietly in the background while the public-facing investigation continued. Sheriff Chris Nanos held a press conference following the arrest that was, by most accounts, deliberately measured. He confirmed that the decision to arrest Annie Guthrie had been based on cumulative findings rather than any single piece of evidence, and he was explicit that the investigation was far from over. That phrase carried obvious implications. It signaled that law enforcement was not treating the arrest as a conclusion, but as a development within a broader and continuing process. Whether that meant additional arrests were being considered, or simply that the search for Nancy Guthrie remained the central and unresolved priority, was not made clear. But the careful language used by the sheriff left room for further developments, and most observers recognized that. Tommaso Keone remained a significant figure in the public conversation even without facing charges of his own. Photographers captured him leaving a law office in the days following the arrest. He made no comment to the press. His attorney issued a single brief statement asserting confidence that the truth would prevail, the kind of language that is standard in these situations and carefully constructed to say very little while maintaining a public position. Financial institutions reportedly connected to the family were said to have initiated internal compliance reviews, not as a result of proven wrongdoing, but because high-profile criminal investigations involving financial questions tend to trigger exactly that kind of procedural response from banks and related institutions. It is a routine consequence of the circumstances rather than an indication of independent findings, but it added another visible layer to an already complicated situation. The political dimension of the story also attracted attention, though it remained at the margins rather than the center. Caroline Leavitt, when asked by reporters whether Donald Trump had been briefed on the case, responded that the administration was aware of the situation. That careful phrasing, aware rather than involved or engaged, suggested the White House was monitoring developments without taking any active role. FBI Director Kash Patel continued to address questions from journalists and maintained a consistent position, confirming that his team was actively engaged with the digital forensics dimension of the case while declining to confirm specific findings or connect them publicly to particular individuals. His repeated references to digital evidence as a central pillar of the investigation were noted by legal analysts, who pointed out that building a case around converging streams of data, phone location records, GPS logs, encrypted messages, and smart home systems is a methodical process that takes time but tends to produce durable results when done thoroughly. Outside the Guthrie residence, the public reaction had taken on a visible and physical form. Protesters gathered, representing both sides of the divide that the case had opened up. Some were calling for justice for Nancy Guthrie. Others were holding signs insisting on the presumption of innocence and pushing back against what they saw as a rush to judgment in the court of public opinion. The divide between those two positions was not subtle. It reflected a broader tension that runs through many high-profile cases, particularly those that unfold in real time across social media, where narratives harden quickly and the space for nuance tends to shrink considerably. Online, the conversation had not calmed down. If anything, the arrest intensified it. Comment. Sections on news articles and social media posts were running hot, with firmly held opinions pulling in opposite directions. Some people had concluded that the financial evidence, the timeline inconsistencies, and the physical forensics all pointed clearly toward guilt. Others argued that everything circulating publicly was either unverified, misrepresented, or the product of a media environment that had decided on a story before the facts were fully established. Both positions contained elements worth taking seriously. The evidence that had been confirmed officially was real and significant, but a meaningful portion of what was driving the public narrative had come from anonymous sources, unverified accounts, and reporting that had not been independently corroborated. That distinction matters, and it is one that tends to get lost when a story moves at the pace this one has. Legal analysts appearing on television programs and podcasts throughout this period were careful to draw a Versailles line between what had been established in any official capacity and what remained in the territory of informed speculation. Several noted that the charges, when they came, would need to be supported by evidence that could withstand scrutiny in a courtroom, a standard that is considerably higher than the one applied in public debate. Grand jury proceedings, if they were indeed underway, as suggested by sources close to the case, would give prosecutors the opportunity to present their evidence to an independent body and receive a determination on whether it was sufficient to proceed. That process, by its nature, takes place out of public view, which means the gap between what people were discussing online and what was actually happening legally was likely significant. Civil consequences were also being discussed alongside the criminal dimensions of the case. Legal commentators pointed out that regardless of how criminal proceedings are ultimately resolved, the financial questions raised during the investigation could trigger separate civil litigation. Trusts and estates become contested territory when criminal allegations enter the picture. Family members find themselves on opposite sides of legal disputes that run parallel to and sometimes outlast the criminal process. Assets can be frozen during proceedings, accounts reviewed, and inheritance arrangements challenged. None of that had happened yet, but it was the direction in which the case was clearly moving if the financial motive reported by sources close to the investigation turned out to be substantiated. That tension between what is known and what is suspected, between confirmed fact and informed speculation, sits at the heart of where this case stands. Nancy Guthrie, an 84-year-old woman, remains missing. That is the fact that grounds everything else. Whatever the investigation ultimately reveals about motives, finances, timelines, or the events of that night, the central reality is that an elderly woman disappeared And her family, her community, and now a much wider public are waiting for answers that have not yet come. The investigation is continuing. Evidence is being processed. Legal proceedings are moving through their early stages. And the 41 minutes that first drew investigators' attention, that gap between a camera going dark and a pacemaker monitoring app losing its signal, has still not been publicly and fully explained. It remains the detail that everyone involved keeps returning to, because it sits at the intersection of everything the case raises: timing, access, intent, and the question of what really happened inside that house on the night Nancy Guthrie was last seen. Whatever comes next, and there will be further developments, this case has already moved well beyond where it began. It started as the disappearance of an elderly woman and became something considerably more complicated, raising questions about family, money, trust, and the gap between the image people present publicly and what may be happening privately. Those are not easy questions, but they are the ones this investigation is now working to answer, and at some point those answers will have to surface.